A warping board is used to measure yarn, the length of the yarn for a weaving. To get started, I'll start with a slip knot. Taking my yarn, twisting it, and pulling the long part of the yarn through to make a slip knot. This loop will be put on the end of the warping board peg and tightened. So I'm starting at the very bottom of the warping board peg. I slide the slip knot on and pull the 2 strings of thread to tighten the knot. And then when I'm starting from the first peg to the second peg, I want the yarn to go up and over the second peg. The third peg, this yarn goes underneath and stays underneath to the 4th peg. So you can see there's more distance between these 2 pegs than there is between these 2 pegs on this side. That's why I'm starting on this side. I want to have more distance right here between these 2 pegs where I'm starting to cross my yarn. It goes up and down and under. So this is 1 yard here. If I ever have to pause, I just wrap my yarn around a peg to hold the yarn in place before I start going again. And then I just unwrap it to get going again. So right here between these 2 pegs, we'll be making a cross. So going one direction, the yarn goes up, over, and then underneath the peg. Coming back, it's also going to go up, over, and underneath the peg, but because we're going in opposite directions, it will form an X here. And this is what keeps our yarn in order. One comes up, over, one goes under, over, under. So right here where the cross is, it keeps the yarn in order. When we're threading our loom, it makes it so much easier and prevents it from tangling, or helps prevent it. So as you're working, so I paused and I wrapped my yarn around to keep tension on the yarn. As you're warping your yarn, you want to make sure to hold tension. So I'm pulling slightly as I do this, not so hard that the yarn is stretching too much. So I've just warped 1 yard. At the bottom is the only place you're going to make a cross. So I go over, under, and then around. Now I'm coming back up to this peg here. So from 1 peg to the other side, that's 1 yard. From this peg up and over is 2 yards. Now I'm warping again 3 yards, and then again 4 yards. When I get to the 4th yard, this is how long I want my warp to be. Instead of going up to the next peg, I'm going to come back down to the 3rd peg right here. Then I go back across and I'm going back the other way. This goes to the peg on the opposite side and then down to the opposite side. This is where I need to continue making the cross. So when I get down to the right side of the warping board, the bottom right side, when I come around this peg, I'm going to go up and then under the 2nd peg here in the cross. So you can see right here, there's an X is forming between the 2. So I just remember up and under, and then I come to this peg and go back around. Up and under. And then I start going up again. So as I'm warping to get my yarn off the cone, I'm lifting my yarn straight up so that the cone doesn't tip over. And I just continue doing this back and forth. So when I get back to the cross, over and then under the peg, and then I go to the end, again go over and under the peg. So it's the same motion, over then under, but because I'm going in an opposite direction, it forms that cross. So over and then under. I'm going to pause here for a moment. You can see I'm wrapping my yarn just to hold tension. And then you can see as if you are warping and your yarn starts coming towards the edge of the warping board, you can just push it back. So right here, the cross is being formed. And you can see here, every other thread either comes up from one side or up from the other side and goes under the opposite side. So that's keeping my threads in order. This is really important when I start warping the loom. So to get back going again, you can see I'm holding tension with one hand as I unwrap that thread, and I just continue the process. So remember at the end when you go up and over here, I'm going back down. So at the cross I go over then under, wrap around this end yarn or the end peg, over and under. And then every time I need more thread from the cone, I just lift straight up from the cone so that my cone doesn't get tipped over. If I pull on the side, it will knock the cone over, and then I have another problem to deal with. And I like using two hands as I'm warping so I don't have to reach one all the way across. You can warp slower, whatever works for you. All right, so the length of the warp is determined by the amount of pegs that I'm warping this on. So right here, this is 1 yard here, 2, 3, and 4 yards. And then the width of the weaving is determined by how many threads are in this cross, or actually in the whole warp. But what you want to do is make sure when you're counting your threads to make sure you have the right number of threads, you're going to count either in the cross or right here on one of these solid yards of thread. Right here where the threads are separated in two pieces because they're wrapping around a warp, if you count one section of it, it's only half of the warp. So your weaving would be double in width. So you want to make sure to count in one of these flat areas here where all the thread is together, not where it's separated right here or down here or right here. If I were going to count it right here where the cross is, I want to make sure to count both sides of the yarn. So here's a closer shot of the cross. You can see right here, 1 yarn comes from one side, 1 from the other side. So I'm going to go ahead and just count right here where all the thread is together to make sure I don't accidentally just count half the yarn. So that's 14 pieces of yarn. My yarn is 15 ends per inch, so I'm going to do one more pass of warping. So I have 14 threads and I need just one more. So I just need to go one more pass, and that means I'm going to stop at the top here because every time I go to the top and then back down, that's 2 passes of thread. So this will be 15 ends or 15 pieces of thread. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and I'm just wrapping this to hold it in place. And next I need to start tying off my warp. So this is only warped for 1 inch. If you were going to weave something that's 10 inches and it's 15 ends per inch, you'd need 150 threads. Sometimes as I'm warping, say I count this and it's 15, I'll go ahead and do a small slip knot in a different color just so that I can, or a bow, so I can keep track and I don't have to recount all of the warp as I'm going. So if I were going to keep warping, I could just take my thread, tie it in a bow, and then keep warping. And every time I have 15, I tie it in a bow so that I know once I have 10 bundles of 15 or 150 threads. So I'm not doing that right now. And I'm going to show you how to tie your warp off in case it needs to be dyed. So first I'm taking a different color thread just because it's easier to see. The very first thing you have to be concerned about is the cross. We want to secure the cross. This keeps the thread in order, so it's easier to work with when you're threading your loom. If it's not in order and you take one thread from one side of the warp into the other side, your thread just gets really tangled. So here's a close-up of the cross, and I need to tie this cross off so the threads stay in place. So first I'm opening up one side of the cross, and I'll put a piece of yarn through. I like to use a different color of yarn so that I can see it easily. And then I go from behind and bring the yarn through the other side of the cross. So you can see right here, when I open up the cross, I have two pieces of yarn coming through. Now, I want to make sure that my yarn is not too tight because I'm going to dye this yarn. So I want to keep my cross, the tie of my cross, nice and loose. So I'm giving it a couple extra inches, and I take those two threads together, and I'm just making a loop. So I just have the ends of the yarn over the yarn that's going through the cross, and then I just pull the ends through that loop, and then I'll tighten that knot right there. So you can see right here, the cross is nice and secure with that yarn. And now I'm going to tie both sides of the cross. If I wasn't going to dye the yarn, I would tie this really tight just to be extra careful. So now I need to tie the top side of the cross, the bottom, the other top, and the bottom, all in between the cross. So instead of just wrapping this, this is more important if you have more thread than what I have. I only have 15 strands, but I'm just showing you how to do this. You want to take some clumps and weave that yarn through. So it goes under one clump, then over, then under. And then when it comes back, it goes over where it was under where it was over, and over again. So you can see if I pull that out here, it starts going under, over, under, and then around, over, under, over. And that just helps keep the thread a little bit organized. I'm not being particular about how many pieces of yarn are in one clump. Likely if I had 150 threads, 2 of these clumps would be one clump, 2 of those inches that I worked off. And then I'm going to tie it the same way, where I bring my yarn over to make a loop, and then I'm going to pull through that loop the 2 threads right there. So that allows the yarn to stay organized, but it can move freely. So now I'm repeating that with all the sides. So this is the top right side. I'm only doing 2 clumps because it's not a lot of yarn. And then the bottom right side. And the bottom left side. So really, really important to make sure that cross is tied off. If we lose the cross, it's a mess, and you don't want to have to deal with a lost cross before you're threading your loom. So I have the cross right here. I have the top of both sides of the cross tied off, and the bottom of both sides tied off. Now I'm going to tie my warp. So every yard of the warp, I will do the same thing. So I have a piece of yarn that's folded in half. And I start by clumping it. I'm just making 3 clumps right here. And you can see I went over, under, over, and now when I bring it back, I want to divide the same clumps and go under, over, under. So I have this yarn here, and then I will tie it off, but make sure that I have plenty of room for the yarn to move so that it's not resisted. If I were to tie it really tightly, the yarn would get resisted, and when I'm dyeing it, it would not accept the dye in that area, and that's not something I want for this warp. So I'm going to go ahead and do it to this yard, and this yard, but also show you the ends of the warp and how to deal with those. So this is different. The ends will get cut off. They won't be part of the weaving. So I'm just taking another piece of yarn, and the starting end where I had that slip knot, I want to make sure the yarn goes through the inside of that area that's wrapped around. So the yarn goes through here and also through the loop, the slip knot that's on that peg. So the yarn comes up and through, and I'm just taking it to the outside of the peg, and I'm just going to tie a knot. So first I tie it and I'm pulling it as tight as possible. I want to keep all that yarn together. And then I'm going again and knotting it right there. Now to the end, the top part, I'm going to go ahead and put this yarn inside of that loop right there. And I caught the end of the yarn right there. So it's still wrapped around the peg, but I'm going to cut it after I tie this together. So I make sure that end yarn is in that bundle. And I tied it and knotted it. And now I'm unwinding that end, and I'll just take it and tie it together. So I just have, I'm going to go ahead and cut it. I just took a loop and went ahead and tied it all together. This will get cut off on the end, but you don't want that string to get loose and fly into the dye bath. It'll tangle all the yarn, so you want to make sure to keep that nice and organized. So I have 2 more ties here, and then I'll show you how to chain this off. So all of my areas within the yards of the warp are tied off, so they're woven together loosely. So this is divided in 3 sections: over, under, back around, under, over, under, and then it's tied. And you can see I've tied it loose enough that it holds the thread together, but they can still move, so it doesn't resist the thread from dyeing. I've also, really important to tie the cross off. So I have the cross tied. The top and the bottom of the cross are also tied. You can tie this area really tight right here because it will end up just being loom waste at the very beginning of the weaving where you're evening out the weaving. I just kept it loose to make sure it doesn't resist the yarn when I'm dyeing it. So once the yarn is all tied off, and the bottom, the back is tied off here, and this is tied very tight, and the beginning of the warping is tied very tight also, I will just take this, slide this off, and you can see I'm holding tension here. So I'm going to hold tension as I work, and I'm putting my hand through that loop, and then I grab the loop, grab the yarn that's separating to make a loop, and I put my hand through this and I pull that yarn through. And then I'm going to keep taking my hand through the loops and pull it through. So I'm pulling the yarn through, and here I'll take this yarn off, and I keep pulling the yarn through. So you can see the yarn now is becoming this chain. And this is to organize the yarn when I move it. So if I'm not going to dye the yarn right away, or I need to transfer the yarn to dye it, I want to chain it. And so here I just pull it off where the cross is. And it's all tied, so I don't have to worry about the cross coming undone. And I pull it till the end. Now I have this loop in the very end loop. I don't want to tie it. I can, once I am ready to dye the yarn, or to thread my loom, I can really easily pull this and the whole chain will come undone. So you can see how easily that happens. This is just to organize the yarn as I am trying to transport the yarn into dyeing or into threading the loom.